Imagine a little child sitting alone in their room, staring at the ceiling. Their toys are scattered, but they're not playing. Instead, they're wondering why the house feels so heavy, why their laughter always seems too loud, why the silence in between is deafening. They can't explain it, they can't name it, but they feel it, the weight of something unspoken. Maybe it's a parent's coldness. Maybe it's the yelling behind closed doors. Maybe it's just the absence of warmth. The child learns early that the world is unpredictable, and because of that, they start carrying an invisible backpack filled with confusion, shame, and longing. Years later, that same child is now an adult, and when life gets heavy, they reach for something, anything that dulls the noise. What if the addiction isn't the real problem? What if it's the solution to a pain that was never healed in the first place? See, most people think of addiction as a weakness, a moral failing, or a bad habit that spirals out of control. But after analyzing the psychology of thousands of people and looking at countless studies, I realized something much deeper. Addiction is often not about the substance or the behavior itself. It's about the emotional wound underneath it. It's about childhood trauma, and once you see that, you can't unsee it. The patterns become painfully clear. Now, before we go further, let's make something clear. Trauma isn't always something dramatic. It's not only about big events like loss or violence. Sometimes it's about what didn't happen, the hug you never received, the reassurance you never heard, the presence that was absent when you needed it most. Children don't just need food and shelter to grow. They need attunement, safety, and unconditional love. And when that's missing, the nervous system gets wired in a state of threat. That state doesn't just go away with age, it lingers, and one day, it finds an outlet. That outlet often looks like addiction. Think about it like this. The human brain has one mission: to protect us from pain. And when the pain feels unbearable, it will search for shortcuts. Substances, distractions, behaviors, they become shortcuts to comfort. That's why addiction is so powerful. It's not because people want to destroy themselves. It's because deep down, they want relief. Relief from memories, from feelings, from loneliness. Addiction is not about chasing pleasure. It's about escaping pain. Here's where it gets even more fascinating. Neuroscientists have found that when a child experiences early stress or neglect, their brain develops differently. The stress hormone cortisol floods their system more often than it should. Over time, this rewires the reward circuits in the brain, especially the dopamine pathways. Dopamine is the chemical that motivates us, that tells us, this feels good, do it again. But in children who grow up with trauma, the dopamine system becomes fragile. Ordinary joys like connection, play, or small achievements don't light it up the way they should. So later in life, when that person stumbles upon alcohol, or gambling, or even endless scrolling on a phone, the brain suddenly lights up like it's been waiting its whole life for this. It says, finally, relief. Finally, I can feel something other than emptiness. That's the hidden bridge between childhood trauma and adult addiction. But let me ask you something. Have you ever noticed how some people seem to carry an invisible sadness, even if they smile all the time? They laugh at parties, they achieve at work, but if you look close enough, you can see it. The haunted look in their eyes. That's often unprocessed childhood pain. And here's the kicker. The brain doesn't distinguish between emotional wounds and physical wounds. To the nervous system, they're both threats. That's why someone can crave substances as strongly as someone craves air when drowning. It's not weakness, it's survival. When I first came across this research, it shook me, because it explained something I had seen over and over again, why people who seem so strong, so capable, would suddenly spiral into addiction. It wasn't because they lacked discipline, it was because they were carrying hidden memories, hidden emotions, hidden beliefs like, I'm not enough, I'm unlovable, I'm broken. And addiction became their way of quieting those voices. For a while, it works. That's the dangerous part. For a while, it actually feels like healing. But the problem is, the relief is temporary. The pain always comes back. And so the cycle begins. Now, let's open a loop here, because I want you to think about something. If childhood trauma shapes the brain in such a way that it becomes vulnerable to addiction later, does that mean people are doomed? Are we forever trapped by our past? The answer is much more complex and much more hopeful than you might think. But before I explain that, let's go even deeper into how trauma actually gets stored in the body and why it resurfaces in such powerful ways. See, memories aren't just stories in our head. They're sensations, patterns, and triggers stored in the nervous system. That's why you can feel your stomach drop when someone raises their voice, or why a certain smell, a certain tone, can suddenly bring you back to childhood without warning. It's not conscious, it's biological. And because of this, unresolved trauma often creates what psychologists call emotional flashbacks. These are moments when an adult suddenly feels the helplessness of a child again, even if they don't realize why. And in that state, the urge for escape is overwhelming. That's when addiction feels irresistible. It's not about wanting to feel high, it's about wanting to feel safe. But here's something you may not have heard before. Addiction isn't just about substances like alcohol or drugs. It can be about work, achievement, social media, even relationships. Anything that provides temporary relief can become addictive if the wound underneath is strong enough. And this is why trauma-informed therapy has become such an important field, because it shifts the question from "what's wrong with you?" to "what happened to you?" That shift alone changes everything. It moves us from judgment to compassion, from shame to understanding. Let me give you an example. There was a study where researchers looked at people who had experienced multiple forms of childhood adversity. Things like neglect, household conflict, instability. They found that the more adverse experiences a person had, the higher their risk of addiction later in life. Not just slightly higher, exponentially higher. And the reason is simple. Each trauma adds another layer of pain the brain must find a way to cope with. The more layers, the stronger the need for relief. Addiction becomes the brain's imperfect attempt at self-soothing. But let's pause here because I want to bring you back to that child I mentioned at the start. The one staring at the ceiling, wondering why life feels so heavy. That child isn't broken. That child is simply trying to survive in an environment that isn't nurturing them. And survival strategies can look different. Some children become perfectionists, always chasing approval. Others become rebels, acting out to gain attention. And some retreat into themselves, building inner worlds to escape outer chaos. Later in life, these survival strategies can morph into addictions, but they all began as adaptations. Brilliant, necessary adaptations to unbearable circumstances. That shift in perspective is vital, because if we see addiction as an adaptation, not a flaw, we start to see people not as broken, but as survivors. And that leads us to an even deeper realization. If childhood trauma wires the brain toward addiction, then healing trauma can rewire it toward freedom. The same neuroplasticity that once created vulnerability can also create resilience. But how? That's the question that changes everything. So let's return to the question we left open. If trauma wires the brain toward addiction, are we forever trapped by what happened in childhood? The answer, surprisingly, is no. The brain is not a fixed machine. It's more like clay. It changes, reshapes, adapts. And this ability to rewire, known as neuroplasticity, is one of the most powerful discoveries of modern psychology and neuroscience. What was shaped by pain can also be reshaped by healing. But the process requires something most people underestimate: safety. Think about it. Addiction thrives in isolation, in shame, in the silence of "I can't tell anyone about this." Healing, on the other hand, requires connection. The nervous system that was wounded in relationship can only truly be healed in relationship. That might mean therapy, where someone finally listens without judgment. It might mean a trusted friend, where vulnerability is met with compassion instead of rejection. It might even mean learning to become your own safe presence, offering to yourself the words you never heard as a child. Over time, this sense of safety allows the brain to calm down. Cortisol lowers, the stress response weakens, and when that happens, the cravings for escape slowly start to lose their grip. Now here's where it gets even more interesting. Studies show that practices like mindfulness, meditation, and deep breathing don't just calm you down in the moment. They actually rewire the brain circuits that were dysregulated by trauma. The prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for decision-making, becomes stronger. The amygdala, the part of the brain that triggers fear, becomes less reactive. And dopamine pathways, those same ones that were hijacked by substances, can begin to respond again to ordinary joys, the warmth of sunlight, the laughter of a loved one, the satisfaction of creating something meaningful. Healing, in other words, is not about removing the past. It's about giving the nervous system new experiences of safety, joy, and connection that rewrite the old story. But here's a truth most people miss. Healing doesn't happen in one big moment. It happens slowly, almost invisibly, in small choices repeated over time. Choosing to sit with discomfort for a few seconds instead of numbing it. Choosing to reach out instead of withdrawing. Choosing to speak kindly to yourself instead of harshly. These moments might feel small, but to the nervous system, they are monumental. Each one is like a stitch, slowly repairing the torn fabric of the self. Let me ask you something. Have you ever noticed how certain people, even after going through years of addiction, seem to radiate a kind of wisdom once they've healed? Almost as if the very thing that once broke them has become their greatest teacher. That's not a coincidence. When someone walks through the fire of trauma and learns to live without numbing, they develop an extraordinary depth of empathy. They can sense the unspoken pain in others. They can offer comfort without judgment. And in many cases, they become guides for others who are still trapped. It's almost poetic. The wound becomes the gift. The weakness becomes the strength. That transformation is not just psychological, it's spiritual. And yet, let's be honest, the path is not easy. Addiction can feel like an anchor that keeps pulling you back down just when you think you've surfaced. But this is where self-compassion becomes critical. Many people stuck in cycles of addiction think, I failed again, I must be broken. But the truth is, every slip, every struggle is part of the rewiring process. Think of it like learning to walk after an injury. You fall, you stumble, but each attempt is strengthening muscles that will one day carry you with ease. Healing from trauma is no different. It's not about perfection, it's about persistence. Now here's a curiosity loop I want to open for you. If trauma can shape the brain and healing can reshape it, then what role does meaning play in all of this? Because here's what psychologists have discovered. People who overcome addiction rarely do it by willpower alone. They do it when they find something bigger than the addiction itself. A purpose, a passion, a reason to keep moving forward. Meaning is the antidote to emptiness. And when someone finds meaning, whether it's through art, service, faith, or simply the commitment to live fully, they no longer need the substance to fill the void. The void begins to fill itself. Viktor Frankl, a psychiatrist who survived the Holocaust, once wrote, "Those who have a why to live can bear almost any how." That truth applies profoundly here. Childhood trauma often robs us of our sense of worth, our sense of belonging, our sense of why. Addiction becomes the placeholder. But when we rediscover meaning, when we reconnect with the part of ourselves that was buried but never destroyed, the addiction begins to lose its power. Because what the brain was searching for all along wasn't a substance. It was connection, purpose, and love. But let me paint this picture more vividly. Imagine that same child from earlier, the one staring at the ceiling, confused and lonely. Now imagine them as an adult, sitting in a quiet room, breathing deeply, maybe with tears in their eyes, finally telling their story to someone who doesn't turn away. In that moment, something shifts. The child within feels seen, the adult feels lighter, and the cycle begins to break. This is not a fantasy. This is what healing looks like in real life for countless people who dare to face their pain with courage. And here's the final twist that I discovered after all this research. Healing from trauma and addiction isn't just about the individual. It's about generations. Studies on what's called intergenerational trauma show that the wounds of one generation often pass down to the next, not just through behavior, but even through biology. Children of parents who struggled with unresolved trauma can inherit stress patterns in their own nervous systems. But the opposite is also true. Healing can also be passed down. When one person decides to break the cycle, to face the pain instead of numbing it, they don't just change their own life. They change the trajectory of everyone who comes after them. That is the power of this journey. It's not just personal, it's collective. So where does that leave us? Childhood trauma can lead to addiction. That much is true, but it doesn't end there. The story is not locked. It can be rewritten. The same brain that once sought escape can learn to seek presence. The same heart that once felt broken can discover resilience. And the same life that once seemed doomed can become a light for others still wandering in the dark. If you've stayed with me this long, maybe it's because some part of this story feels personal. Maybe you see yourself in it, or maybe you see someone you love. And if that's true, I want you to remember one thing. Addiction is not the opposite of willpower. Addiction is the language of pain, and healing is the language of love. Every step toward compassion, every moment of connection, every act of courage, these are not small, they are revolutionary, because they prove that no matter how deep the wound, no matter how far the fall, the human spirit was never meant to stay broken. It was meant to rise. So here's the final question I'll leave you with. What if the very scars you carry are not signs of weakness, but maps? Maps that can lead you not only out of the darkness, but into a life richer, deeper, and more meaningful than you ever imagined. That's the paradox of healing. It doesn't erase the past, it transforms it. And in that transformation lies freedom.